Europeans bringing their own particular form of slavery to Africa and to what to them was a new world. The European discovery, that is a discovery for them, of the Western Hemisphere, of the Americas, North American and South American continents, coincided with their decision to bring into that world a form of what I'll describe as chattel and racial slavery for the explicit purpose of growing cash crops in what we call a mercantilist system, in which overseas colonies play a role to help those countries accumulate wealth. To put that another way, as your textbook does, the Americas and the what they call mother countries back home in Europe that established colonies there, like England or Spain or France, they developed those colonies and then by proxy themselves by using African human beings as property, as labor force, as a mass labor force to grow specifically cash crops. In other words, the societies that were built here in the Western Hemisphere where we are were built on the backs of African peoples. I think your textbook makes that pretty plain. So we'll look at early contacts between key European nations and West African kingdoms, what those relationships look like, the development of the Atlantic slave trade. That's the first big thing here today, including the Middle Passage, that is the passage for slaves as chattel property across, but as also, of course, human beings across the Atlantic Ocean. And then we'll look at what historians will sometimes call the charter generations, that is the earliest generations of slaves in the New World, for whom life looked substantially different than it would for later, what we might call revolutionary generations that we'll look at on Wednesday when we have American Slavery Part 2. But first, the origins of the Atlantic slave trade. First of all, it's important to note that prior to kind of where we'll pick up here today, around 1500, or really the early to mid 1400s, slavery had existed across the globe for millennia, for thousands of years. Before that time, in places all the way from China to India to ancient Greece and Rome and Europe, Russia, and in the Americas, and yes, in Africa, in the Arab world too. Slavery had existed in all of those places in one form or another. But, as we'll see, in this time period that we're looking at here, Europeans transformed that institution. The slavery that Europeans bring to the New World in the form of enslaved peoples from Africa, that's something that is profoundly different than anything we had ever seen before in human history. Something far more inhumane and barbaric than slavery at any other place in time. A system built and sustained upon a foundation, first and foremost, of extreme violence. And furthermore, a chattel system of slavery. Does anybody know what that means, chattel slavery? Sounds like cattle, but not exactly etymologically related, although there is a similarity there. Yeah.
Is chattel slavery where profits start in turn? like a certain amount of time or something like that?
Interestingly, this actually, a lot of forms of slavery you would have seen in other places in time would fall in line with what you just said. Like we'll look at, in the early American colonies, there was something called indentured servitude, where you would have a set period of time where your labor was owed to somebody else, but you would become free. Interestingly, this is the opposite of that, in that slaves under a chattel slave system never become free. They're slaves for life, and in fact, the condition of the child follows that of the mother. So regardless of who the father is, a baby born to a slave woman is also a slave for life, regardless. What chattel slavery means specifically is a system in which slaves are considered property, as in not human beings, but property to be bought and sold. That is, it involves the commodification of human beings. The essence of a chattel slave system then is a person with a price. Of course, this could be resisted in the mind and the heart and the soul of those persons enslaved, and indeed it was. But in the minds and in the legal structures and in the ledgers of the enslavers, slaves were considered property. They had no rights as human beings, and that is something you did not see in slavery in other parts of the world and throughout world history. Furthermore, slavery in the New World, and specifically here in what becomes the United States of America, the 13 English and then British colonies that become eventually the United States after the Revolution, when slavery is written into law in these colonies, including in Georgia, it is written into law as a racially based system whereby slavery is associated with the color of one's skin. And you've equated in the law slavery and blackness, which means by proxy you have equated in the law whiteness and freedom. Which means you've instituted a system in which even very poor white people occupy a privileged position in society simply by virtue of the color of their skin. White people, in other words, would never be slaves. They could be what I alluded to earlier, and we'll talk about this, indentured servants, but never slaves. And then finally, the slavery that Europeans bring into the Americas is unique in that they seek out and purchase and bring to this new part of the world literally millions of enslaved people with the primary, if not exclusive, purpose of growing cash crops to make money, to accumulate wealth. We'll talk about what those cash crops are. But if you put all of that together, this is something unique. So to say slavery has existed all throughout the world and for many millennia is not enough. We have to recognize that what we're about to examine is unique.
Can you say what you said about cash crops?
Yeah, so this is the first instance, the only instance in world history in which one people have enslaved en masse another people for the primary, if not exclusive, purpose of growing cash crops. That is, Europeans bring millions of enslaved peoples from Africa to the New World solely, exclusively to grow cash crops. That is, crops that you cultivate not just to survive, but that you cultivate to sell to make money. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And I'll just go ahead and throw out there the major ones. For good reason, in our memory down here, especially in the Deep South, we think about crops that were grown by slaves, and what's probably the first thing that comes to our mind? Right. That being said, the period of time in which slaves grew cotton here in the Deep South is extraordinarily small when put up against the period of time in which there were slaves in the New World, and even here in North America. So we won't even talk about cotton, even won't come up today. So the early cash crops that enslaved people grow over in this part of the world initially are sugar. and tobacco and rice. Sugar, tobacco, and rice are the major cash crops grown during these charter generations. All extremely valuable back then.
What were they using tobacco for?
Let's say again.
What were they using tobacco for?
So they would use it to smoke it. This is before they mass manufactured like cigarettes and cigars, but they would have like pouch tobacco that you would smoke in pipes. And it was like tobacco is what they call a New World crop. It is something that had not existed in either Europe or Africa or Asia prior to the 1500s. So when Europeans, stumble upon the New World and they find Native Americans know how to grow this and dry the leaves and smoke it, it's like a rage back in Europe. It's like the thing to do. Does that make sense? And so if you could find like a good strain of it that people thought, tasted good when you smoked it and you had a place to grow it, then what do you need? Well, people to do the work. And that's where they eventually turn to African slave labor. And it makes people boatloads of money because everybody back in Europe in the taverns and everywhere is wanting to sit around and smoke pipe tobacco. And then, of course, eventually figure out how to roll it up into cigarettes and cigars and so on. And this is even before, like, in the 20th century, as we now know, or acutely aware, at least I hope, companies like R.J. Reynolds and Winston-Salem and whatnot, they put nicotine in it to make you addicted to it. Even before that, it was still like a rage thing to do. And sugar was something that previously these people in Europe would have gotten from India. And that's a long way away. That sugar would have to go through a number of different middlemen. It was expensive, but it was something that could be finer and could replace, as a sweetener, honey would be the primary thing Europeans would have used. But, granular sugar is something that could replace that. And then on top of that, and I'm probably getting ahead of myself because this is something I probably will talk about later, but since I decided to throw the cash crops out there and you asked a really good question, sugarcane cultivation. You have the tall stalks of sugarcane, you have to chop them all down. It's very arduous work. And you squeeze the juice out, and then you spin from the juice out the granular stuff that would become like table sugar, which we would pay like $1 for at Kroger, so it's no big deal to us. So you have to kind of transport yourself back to a place and time where this would have been like a prized commodity. The liquid, the thick gooey stuff left over, you know what that is? Molasses, which you could use as a sort of syrup, or you could actually distill it and turn it into rum, which is also very valuable. So all of that to say, growing sugarcane was huge. And then rice is a staple food. Rice is something that you can grow a population with. And also, it can only be grown in certain key environments, which the area down around the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, where it's very low-lying and very swampy, if you could tame that swamp, so to speak, develop the right kind of irrigation, that could be ideal for growing rice, and that becomes an extraordinarily valuable commodity. Now, African slavery before the Portuguese arrived. Typically, people were enslaved in Africa as captives of war. You would have warfare between rival kingdoms, conflicts perhaps on a lesser scale between rival clans, perhaps even smaller scale than that between rival villages or families. But in those kinds of conflicts, those who are not killed might be enslaved. And of course, they are not identified as slaves by the color of their skin, for in varying shades and degrees, the peoples of sub-Saharan Africa are all black. And slaves were typically integrated in some way into village or city life. That is, they're not set apart. And they more or less did the same work that other people are doing. they often had some basic human rights. They could often purchase their own freedom while doing work on the side and accumulating some money. They could, in some instances, own property. They were not, again, set aside in some other part of the village or the city as some sort of other substandard human beings. This is not to put a glossy veneer. I mean, slavery is slavery and is an inhumane system. But we have to recognize that there are varying degrees of that. And what we're about to see is matters of degrees worse than anything we had seen. Now, there were some instances over the years of slaves being traded beyond sub-Saharan Africa, especially through the Sahara Desert trade routes into the Arab Muslim world. Typically, though, when that occurred, slaves who ended up in the Arab Muslim world worked as domestic servants. In other words, if you look at what I just described as what slavery is going to be in the New World, that's not what it looked like either in Africa or in the Arab Muslim world. What we see is qualitatively different. Qualitatively meaning, what is the nature of it? What is it like? What we're going to see is very different. And the numbers are going to be different too, meaning quantitatively, it's going to be dramatically different because of European demand for slaves. Now, initially, the Portuguese, as they are sailing up and down the West African coast in the 1400s, establishing trading ports, they regarded slaves like any other commodity that they would deal in and with West African traders and sell back to Europe, including ivory and gold, of course. And the first slaves that they purchased were sold almost as novelties back to Europe to work as domestic servants, that is. European, or that is specifically Portuguese explorers and traders made contacts with the, as you know, dying or in severe decline empire of Songhai, and the kingdoms, the forest kingdoms on the coast of Dahomey, Oyo, and further south, Congo. So the first slaves brought back to Europe came in the 1440s, and had been purchased from African traders. But also, it's important to note, the Portuguese at the time were also engaging in their own kidnapping raids. So if it was somewhere that was not Songhai, Dahomey, Oyo, Benin, Congo, where there wasn't like a really effective centralized rule, wasn't within the boundaries of the kingdom, the Portuguese and later others could also engage in kidnapping raids where they just went in and kidnapped people and took them into slavery. And it was easy for them to do this because by that time, Western European kingdoms had firearms. They had guns, and other peoples, certainly in West Africa, did not. And when you have guns and the other people don't, that's an extraordinary advantage, needless to say. This is looking out towards the coast from the Portuguese trading fort that becomes a slave fort. That is Elmina Castle. And if you'll indulge me, we'll go there. Let's see, can I get relatively close? Did pretty good. So this is in modern-day nation state of Ghana. If I'm not mistaken, it was from here that the United States President Bill Clinton in the 1990s finally made an official apology on behalf of the United States for its participation in the international slave trade. Falls of Philomena. So this is to protect their institution, or what became an institution, lest anybody change their minds about participation in it. This is a better look here, looking out upon the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. One can imagine enslaved human beings looking out upon that ocean, embarking in a slave ship for what would be the Middle Passage. Probably. Trying to get dropped into the bowels of the castle, but it's not cooperating with me. In any case, a number of these forts survived, and that was certainly not the only one. The Portuguese established those all up and down the West African coast. Now, what were they doing? Well, they're trying to get to India and China and Indonesia. Throughout the 1400s, the Portuguese really, under the leadership of a prince named Henry, known to history as Henry the Navigator, they brought together all the best and brightest minds that knew anything about seafaring, so sailing and designing and building sailing ships, and all the best minds in terms of cartography or map making, and those who knew something about the technology of navigation, that is how to know when you're out in the ocean where you are by looking at the stars in the sky, for example. And they decided, how can we make advancements in being able to efficiently sail the ocean? And in this case, to sail down the West African coastline, if you look here, and to eventually, it would take decades, but to eventually find out where is there, we presume there is an end to the African continent. Where is it, and can we sail around it? Can we get into the Indian Ocean and establish direct contacts with places like India, where from we get sugar and other spices and other fineries? With the islands of Indonesia down here, from which we get all kinds of spices, from cinnamon to cardamom to ginger, things that would be, again, not a big deal to us that get caked up and old and you throw them out of your pantry without even batting an eye, but back then would have been fine and valuable. And then, of course, with China too, from which you got silks and porcelains and opium and all kinds of stuff. But that stuff would get traded either through what they call the Silk Road trade routes through Central Asia, or through the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, meaning it went through this part of the world, which is the Arab Muslim world, the Ottoman Empire, and it got taxed and it got jacked up in price. And then it went through the Mediterranean and went through Italy, where there are a series of city-states there controlled by wealthy banking families and merchant families, and then it got jacked up again there. Meaning by the time this shit got to places like Portugal and its next door neighbor Spain, or certainly to up here England and France, cost a lot. So their thinking is we could establish direct contacts maybe one day and cut out the middleman. This is why Christopher Columbus, an Italian himself, sailing on behalf of Portugal's rival and next door neighbor Spain, sailed west. He was thinking he could make it all the way around that way. And let me make one thing clear, and I know this is sure as shit not a Western Civ class. It's the opposite of that, or should be. And it's not a world history class, but I feel the need in all of my classes to dispel this notion that Christopher Columbus was some kind of genius radical because he thought the world was round and nobody else did. Anybody who had anything to do with this shit knew the earth was round. In fact, Christopher Columbus was dead wrong about the size of the earth and had these two gigantic continents that he nor anyone else in Europe knew existed. Had they not been there, and had this been open ocean, all of his people would have been dead and starved by about right here. That makes sense? In other words, he thought literally to his death When he bumps into the Bahamas and all this shit here, he thinks he's over here. He thinks, because his numbers suggest the size of the earth was smaller than others said, he thinks he had made it all the way around to here. It was Christopher Columbus is famous because of an accident and because of being wrong. And because of stumbling upon a continent that neither he nor anyone else around him knew existed prior to his stumbling upon it. But I digress. While he is sailing west, the Portuguese are sailing south. They're all trying to get over here. All the good stuff is over here. At the same time, Henry the Navigator, his father, the king, and their predecessors, the Portuguese, had been also fighting with peoples of North Africa here, the Berbers. You remember we talked briefly in the last lecture about the Berbers, peoples of North Africa that were there prior to the arrival of the Muslims, of Arab Muslim peoples. And so this is modern day like Morocco, just north of the Sahara Desert, at the trailhead of some of these trading routes that go through Timbuktu. And you know the kind of stuff that's being traded up through those trade routes, and that includes gold from the Wangara gold mines. So Henry knows about these trade routes through the desert, great cities like Timbuktu, where there's a madrasa, a university, and there's all these fine things, and that somewhere down there to the south below the desert are massive gold mines. And this captures his imagination. Who down there controls the gold? And he also came to believe in a legendary and false, and probably safe to say racist tale about the existence of down there a white Christian king named Prester John. Because people like that couldn't wrap their heads around the fact that there had been great black African kings down there, and maybe queens who had controlled those lands where there was all of this gold and wealth. Must be down there a civilized white Christian king, and shouldn't we find a way to make contact with him? This also motivates Henry and the Portuguese in their explorations of the coast of sub-Saharan Africa. Along with, as I was saying, the thought that they could eventually get around Africa, which they do, round about the same time Columbus stumbles into the Bahamas and eventually the Caribbean. They do indeed sail around the Horn of Africa, or Cape Horn, the southern tip of Africa. And they do indeed eventually establish direct links with India and Indonesia. But they also take control of two tiny little islands off the coast of West Africa. And once again, you must indulge. There we go. Sao Tome and Principe, off the coast of present-day Gabon and Equatorial Guinea. Right at the equator. Look at that. There it is. Yep. Just above the equator. So here they actually seized territory. What they did on the mainland is simply establish those trading forts. They did not have the ability at that time to conquer Dahomey or Oyo or Benin. They established these forts, and that's their little footprint. In the case of Sao Tome and Principe, they actually take control of these islands, and they're tiny, and this, by the way, is 1490. Just before they round the tip of Africa, and just before Columbus bumps into San Salvador, the Portuguese actually take control for themselves of Sao Tome and Principe, and here they discover that the climate and the soil are such that they could grow sugarcane, and I'm going to put this in quotation marks, themselves. What I mean is they wouldn't have to go to India or Indonesia to get it. They could grow it on Sao Tome and Principe, but sugarcane cultivation is back-breaking, hard labor in a very, very hot climate. It can be deadly. And so they sure as shit weren't going to do it themselves. What they're going to do is buy slaves from African traders and get them to do it. And here we have the first example of Europeans using enslaved persons from West Africa to grow a cash crop. But, in addition, first of all, let me walk back. Sugarcane cultivation is labor intensive. What I mean is, if you want more product, more sugar, you got to have more laborers. You can't just, for example, like something that's capital intensive means you want more, you got to throw more capital or more money at it. Here, no, you got to have more laborers, but also, it's land intensive. You have to have more land. I mean, that seems like an obvious. You got to have more land to cultivate more of the crop. And these are two tiny little islands. And demand for sugar in Europe was spiking. For sugar and its byproduct, molasses, and by proxy, rum. There's a huge market for this. There's a ton of demand. You could not meet that demand with supply from just these two tiny little islands.
And the Portuguese were the ones that thought that they could make the sugar cane? Or who was it that thought that they...
Well, they are. They have these two islands they've taken control of, and they thought, well, we and again, we meaning not us ourselves, but we can get slaves. We've got these trading contacts with African traders that we get gold and ivory, and yeah, we took a few slaves for them and brought them back to Portugal to work as domestic service. Hey, what if we bought some slaves to them, and instead of taking them to Europe to work as domestic servants, we put them to work growing sugarcane on these islands we've taken where the climate and the soil is perfect to do that. You couldn't grow sugarcane in Portugal, too far north. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So they've got the idea of a labor force, but they only have these two tiny little islands. They would need somewhere much larger to build huge plantations and then purchase and bring in, perhaps thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of slaves to meet the kind of demand that they have. Well, at the very same time that they are mapping the African coastline and bringing slaves into Sao Tome and Principe, they're also sailing west in the way that Columbus did. A guy named Cabral, and along with him a map maker named Amerigo Vespucci. Amerigo ought to sound familiar. They had sailed west. Now, the Spanish are all up in here, in what would become Mexico and in the Caribbean. The Portuguese decide, well, we've sailed down here. Why don't we, when we sail out, what they would do when they're mapping out the west coast of Africa is kind of sail out here and catch the trade winds and see, like, okay, eventually when we sail east, we're going to get to a new place. Eventually, sailing east, we're going to get to here, and there's not going to be any land. And then we're going to realize, oh shit, we made it around. This takes years and years for them to do this. The idea here was, hey, while we're doing that, why don't we also sail west and see what's over here? Columbus thinks he'd made it all the way over. Maybe we could make it to the Spice Islands. And Cabral and Vespucci realized, holy shit, there's a huge continent here. There's no way we know about what's over here near China and the Spice Islands. This ain't that. And Amerigo Vespucci is the one who realizes, this is a new world. This is something new to us we've never discovered before. That's why, and Columbus died thinking it was the East. That's why we don't call this North Columbia and South Columbia. We call it America because Americus is the Latin version of Amerigo, was in Amerigo Vespucci. The point for this lecture is, that's when the Portuguese discovered what would become the colony of Brazil. A massive colony for the Portuguese in which they could import hundreds of thousands of enslaved people from Africa specifically and almost exclusively to cultivate sugarcane and to make them a fortune on the backs of those enslaved persons from Africa. And to provide in the doing the example for subsequent nations of Western Europe establishing colonies as they murdered and pushed out Native Americans in the New World, including England, France, Spain, the Dutch, the Netherlands, providing an example for them to follow. using African slave labor to grow cash crops. Questions about the Portuguese? So by the 1600s to the 17th century, these European seafaring nations, those that had built these great navies, at the expense of other peoples around the world that they were exploiting, including Africans, Native Americans, and Asians. This is the sort of world economy that they have built. By the way, this is the Iberian Peninsula. This is where Portugal is. Here you can see the old Saharan slave trading routes into the Muslim Arab world. Here you see some of the main points of contact: Cape Verde and the Gold Coast, Angola below Congo. Over here, Mozambique. Over here, Mombasa, and by proxy, you have the old city-states like Zanzibar. It's now part of Tanzania, which, by the way, is the nation that we're representing here in Model African Union, if any are interested in that. But you see, here's Portuguese Brazil. So the Spanish colonized, they defeated the Aztecs, colonized Mexico, Cuba, and parts of the Caribbean, Florida for a while, parts of South America where the Incan Empire had been. But over here on the other side of the Amazon rainforest, all of this, the coast of Brazil, Portuguese sugar colony. Literally millions of slaves there cultivating sugarcane by the 18th century. As we'll see, all of the Europe, what we call mother countries of Europe that build colonial empires in the New World, all of them have some islands in the Caribbean. England has some, France has some, the Dutch have some, Spanish have some. They're growing sugarcane also, and by they, I mean enslaved persons from Africa. There's a lively trade over here in the Indian Ocean too, established first, of course, by the Portuguese and sustained by the Dutch and the English and others, that's integrated with this trade in what we call the Atlantic world. But slaves are what make it go, and the cash crops that they produce. And by the way, this is a chattel system, so as valuable as sugar and tobacco and later rice are, the reality is that the most valuable commodity in the entire Atlantic world over here are the slaves themselves. Another map showing you from whence and to where do slaves go in the Atlantic slave trade, specifically in the 18th century. I may have mentioned this before, but throughout the 4 centuries of Atlantic world slavery, there are about 11 million or more souls, human beings, are transported alive across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, that doesn't include hundreds of thousands, if not millions more, who died. But about 11 million, but if you were to look at the period of time in which that volume and transportation and trade and forced migration was highest, it's the 1700s of the 18th century. And if you look at the size of the arrows, you see that the majority of those people end up in Brazil or the Caribbean. Only about 500,000 in this century end up here in the colonies that would become America. You can see that they come especially from the Bight of Benin and from Congo and Angola, to a lesser extent from other parts of West and Southwest Africa, and even down here around Mozambique. Let's back up a little bit, though. I mentioned that other mother countries of Europe, that is, countries that are establishing colonies in the New World in the 1500s, they follow the example of the Portuguese, and where they are able to kill, enslave, get rid of, and in some other way push out Native Americans and seize land in the New World, they then bring in enslaved persons from Africa, typically to grow cash crops. And in the case of the Caribbean islands, that's almost exclusively sugar. There was a brief period where they toyed with the idea of tobacco, but sugar turned out to be, at the time, in more demand. And so the Spanish take Cuba and the eastern half of the island of Hispaniola, Santo Domingo. The Dutch take the island of Curacao. The Dutch are those from the country of the Netherlands. The French take the western half of Hispaniola, which they call Saint-Domingue, same as the Spanish Santo Domingo, what would later become Haiti. And the English take the islands of Jamaica and Barbados and later the Bahamas. The Native Americans that had lived on those islands, what were called the Taino peoples and the Caribs, from which we get the word Caribbean, by the end of the 1500s, they're all gone. They're all dead. Probably the majority of them died of diseases that Europeans brought into the New World that had never existed in the New World. I mentioned, tobacco in the New World had never existed in the Old World of Africa and Asia and Europe. Well, diseases like smallpox had never existed in the New World or the Americas. What that means is Native Americans had zero what we call acquired immunity. That is, they had zero ability to fight those diseases off. So diseases that would have killed a few Africans or Europeans or Asians, they're going to wipe out entire Native American societies. While at the same time, the Spanish in the 1500s, who were the first to get there with Columbus, are enslaving Native Americans and putting them to work in gold and silver mines in that part of the world, or on the Mexican mainland or in South America. The net result for our purposes is that by the end of the 1500s, all the Native Americans in the Caribbean are dead. And Europeans repopulate those islands with black people from Africa, who were almost exclusively enslaved, and who were almost exclusively put to the work of growing sugarcane. Question?
Oh, you just answered it.
Okay, cool. Other questions? Yes, sir.
It's kind of an outside question. So, like,
Okay.
when the Europeans were basically like the British was kicked out of America, right? How long was it until the slave trade ended? I know it ended at some point.
It does, yeah. And we'll talk about this probably in the next lecture. Definitely in the next lecture. But by that time, his question, if you didn't hear it, was, hey, once the British are gone, America's an independent nation, how long does the slave trade continue? Not long. They kind of put it off for a little while and say, let's get the Constitution ratified and we'll deal with it later. But in, I think, 1808, they decided to shut down the importation of slaves from abroad, not because they had some moral epiphany, but because the slave population in America was repopulating at such an incredible rate, you didn't need to import slaves anymore. And in some areas, as we'll talk about even today, they started to worry about, oh shit, are there so many slaves here that we could see what happened in Haiti happen here in America? And we'll talk about this. Haiti is the great example of an actual successful slave revolution. There were so many slaves that find themselves in solidarity with free people of color, as they called them in Haiti, to overthrow the white government there in a revolution. People in America were very afraid of such possibility. But we're not quite there yet. What you do see, though, in the 1500s and into the 1600s, a massive increase in demand in Europe for sugar and for molasses and for rum, which leads then to a massive increase in demand for slaves. So when we talk about, yeah, slavery and slaving existed in Africa prior to European arrival, yeah, well, not only have we gone through in great detail how what Europeans are doing here is very different, think about the numbers. Europeans provide the demand and the incentive for Africans to engage in infinitely more enslaving. And they give African slavers the guns with which to do it. So they provide them the demand and the incentive and the means. In other words, in the 1500s, because of European demand for slaves, enslaving increases in Africa dramatically. And the numbers of people who were enslaved from the 1500s up into the 1800s dwarf anything you had ever seen, and that is a direct 100% result of Europeans wanting more and more and more slaves. Does that make sense? Because they were going to grow the crops that were going to make them money. Right? And yes, there were complicit African kings and princes and traders, and I think your book addresses this in just the right way. No, we cannot let those people off the hook for what they did. They are morally culpable. But a couple of other things to consider. It does not follow from that Europeans are not primarily culpable for the inhumanity that was American slavery. And two, those complicit Africans could not have known the barbarity and inhumanity of the kind of slavery they were selling these people into. They could not have known what slavery was going to be in the hands of European slavers in the New World, which we now know, and which they would eventually figure out, but as your book points out, by the time they did, it was too late. Does that all make sense? Now, what of those who did have to endure the Middle Passage? The passage across the Atlantic Ocean. As I had said a moment ago, estimates are that perhaps as many as 11 million human beings, 11 million souls, survived that passage and made it to the shores of lands in the Western Hemisphere. But that doesn't count the perhaps millions who died of sickness, who committed suicide somehow in the journey, who were killed in attempted mutinies or rebellions aboard these ships, to try to seize control of those ships from the outnumbered slavers. And so the number of those enslaved and initially attempted to be brought over was probably much higher than 11 million. Now, in terms of mutinies, it was not uncommon to have an attempt of the slaves to seize control of these ships. Now, they were shackled together, 200 and 300 in the hulls of these ships, as your book says, like sardines, packed like the chattel that they were in the minds of those slavers, having to endure conditions not fit for livestock, being stuck in the hull, the bottom of those ships for hours, days sometimes at a time, in darkness and human excrement and filth and sweat and heat and humidity in equatorial climates out on the ocean for 2 months long of a journey, chained together. And yet, yes, grossly outnumbering the slavers on that ship and occasionally trying to take advantage of that. There were even a few cases of successful mutinies on these ships, where the slaves massacred the slavers and took control. Rare though it was, it did occasionally happen. Now, what happens when it does happen is all that does is cause the slavers to double down on security measures, and eventually, by the 17th and 18th centuries, not only are the slavers all heavily armed, they have a cannon up at the front of the ship where the ship's captain would be that shoots what we call a grape shot, which if their slaves are trying to rush the front of the ship, you could fire this cannon and mow them down or gun them down. So it becomes rare that such things would be successful. But consider this. Consider that even if we place ourselves in the minds of the most callous, inhumane, and barbaric slavery, a merchant ship's captain or a hand on the deck of one of these ships, even that person has to recognize that these slaves are incredibly valuable property that you have a vested interest in keeping alive. So even if you don't acknowledge their humanity, you still have an interest in them living to get to the New World because that's money, right? Even given that fact, the average death rate on these journeys was something like 15% because the conditions were so putrid. And it could be as high as 40 or 50% if there was an outbreak of disease, which could ravage the crew, same as it could the slaves. I don't have to stress the significance of disease anymore. I'm wearing a mask over my mouth, for God's sake. Among the surviving records we have that tell us what the Middle Passage was like, none are more spectacular than the writings of Olaudah Equiano. And you're going to read some of the excerpts for Quiz 2 from Equiano's writings, detailing how he was kidnapped in West Africa, taken into slavery, sold to traders on the coast, endured the conditions of the Middle Passage that I've just described, and describes them in much more vivid and compelling detail than I did or could. And he ends up not on the very ship in which he was traded, but he ends up serving on a ship. Like as a slave, he ends up as like a deckhand on a ship in the Atlantic world and traveling all throughout the Atlantic world. The Atlantic world, by the way, is the Atlantic Ocean and not just the ships that are traveling back and forth on it, but it includes West Africa and those trading forts and ports. And it includes Western Europe and these mother countries we've been talking about. It includes the colonies. The Atlantic world is the Atlantic Ocean and the areas around it. And if you were somebody who was comfortable kind of in all parts of that world, if you kind of knew a little something of your homeland of West Africa and something of the colonies in the New World and life aboard the ship and something of Europeans too, you were what they called then a Creole. Somebody who is comfortable across cultures. Now that's a word, and if you got family or know anybody from Louisiana, this is a word that can mean different things in different times. For example, speaking of Louisiana, it would later come to describe sort of black Southern culture and specifically cooking of people in New Orleans and South Louisiana as opposed to white Cajun, but that's a digression. My point is that at this time, a Creole is somebody who is of the Atlantic world, is comfortable across cultures, speaks, multiple languages, can be a sort of negotiator or a go-between. Olaudah Equiano is one of those people, and he learns to read and write, and he pens a sort of autobiography or a memoir that tells us much of what we know about what it was like to endure this horrific, unimaginable Middle Passage journey, and you'll get to read some of that. So this is just to reiterate kind of what I had said at the onset, that the form of slavery that Europeans bring to the New World is something new and something very horrible indeed. It's a mass chattel system, that is a system in which Europeans are purchasing slaves by the millions from Africa, considering them, legally speaking, property with no rights as human beings, classifying them as slaves specifically by the color of their skin, writing slavery into law whereby white people, depending on how you define that, would never be slaves, only black people, insisting that the condition of the child followed out of the mother. And by the way, as I pointed out early on too, and to reiterate, when you institute such a racial system, you build white solidarity. If you had poor white people who are upset about their position in society, you've just introduced a slave system that elevates their position in society by guaranteeing that they will never occupy the bottom rung of the social ladder. And then they justify the whole thing by claiming Africans are not civilized, they're heathens. They have no civilization or culture, and so it is natural that a superior people would enslave them. Which is deeply ironic if you consider the barbaric and heathen nature of chattel slavery and the violence that goes with it. That was always the foundation of such a system. It's the Europeans who were behaving in the barbaric and uncivilized way, but they try to flip that on its head and use that as justification, a racist justification for a racial system. And then again, to reiterate, it's the only time we have ever seen one people mass enslave another people for the express purpose of growing cash crops. And I mentioned that word mercantilism. This is the economic system the mother countries of Europe are using to establish colonies over here to provide them with raw materials that they don't have. That's one of the main roles of these colonies, to provide raw materials. Cash crops are among those raw materials. Sugar, tobacco, rice. This map is good, and I know we're running out of time because it shows you sort of the different places from which many slaves come and the different places they end up. Now, they end up mostly here, Portuguese Brazil and the Caribbean, but also, of course, the 13 North American colonies of Britain. They come from the Bight of Benin, they come from Angola and Congo, Mozambique, Senegambia, the Gold Coast, and so on. It also shows you that, the pre-existing slave trade route, or just general trade routes through the Sahara to the Arab Muslim world. Finally, slavery in England's 13 mainland colonies from Georgia on up to Massachusetts. So we're in the 1600s now. By that time, Spain had built this great colonial empire. The Portuguese were colonizing Brazil, but England was a little late for a variety of reasons your book briefly speaks to. But by the 1600s, they had established colonies in the Caribbean at Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad, and a couple others. So here are the islands of the Caribbean. There's Cuba, which is a Spanish possession at the time. This is Hispaniola. Left half, or western half, was French, Saint-Domingue, which becomes Haiti after the Slave Rebellion. Right half, Santo Domingo, or what's now the Dominican Republic. Here are the Bahamas, which become a British colony. That's actually where Columbus bumped into first. But look here, here's Jamaica. That's an English or eventually British colony. And these are the Lesser Antilles. Trinidad's down here, and here's Barbados. The French had some islands here as well. The Dutch did too. So these islands are all kind of divided up. And you can see some French names there, like Guadeloupe. But the point is that by 1600, the English have a few, and they're using them to cultivate sugar. But in the early 1600s, they think about shifting their operations and establishing colonies on the North American mainland, the first of which is Virginia, which was established as a colony to somehow find a way to make profit, which they eventually do in growing tobacco. Which, as sugarcane is a labor-intensive crop and a land-intensive crop. You need to take land from the local Native Americans, and you need to have people to work it. The first labor force that Virginia used was indentured servants, white poor people from England who couldn't afford to pay the way to the New World, but would sign a contract that gave them a free trip, but then made them servants for a period of like 5 to 7 years. But this is not slavery because it's not chattel slavery because they're not property that become free when that term is up. But there are all kinds of problems with indentured servitude they figure out. Particularly when these people become free and start trying to get their own land, they end up in fights with the Native Americans, which the colony doesn't want. And for that and other reasons, like the numbers drying up of people who are willing to come from England to the New World as indentured servants, by the late 1600s, Virginia is looking for a new labor force. Now, they had some ideas. For example, in 1619, and this is why the New York Times project is called the 1619 Project, the first enslaved peoples from Africa arrived in Jamestown, the original town of the colony that would become Virginia. They were few in number. Historians think they might actually have been indentured and not chattel slaves, but they were African. So this seed had been planted, if you will, even though for the next 60 years they would continue to use mostly white indentured servants from England. But by that time they could look to the south in South Carolina. A colony established by English planters from Barbados. Tiny island where there wasn't a lot of land to cultivate sugar cane. And when that land ran out, they decided to go to the mainland and establish their own colony. Only when they established Charlestown or Charleston, they realized the land around it is low-lying swampland that's not suitable to the cultivation of sugar. But oh my, is it not perfect for the cultivation of rice. And as they had done in Barbados with sugar, they import enslaved people from Africa to grow that rice. And they build enormous plantations that eventually will have hundreds of slaves on them, and they make a dramatic fortune doing it. Virginia follows that example and shifts from white indentured servants to African slave labor. Eventually, in the 1700s, all of the cash crop producing mainland colonies do the same. This includes Georgia, a rice producing colony. This includes, outside of Virginia, North Carolina, a tobacco producing colony. Maryland, a tobacco producing colony. If you look at your book too, there's even a handy little chart that shows you when slavery was established and the numbers of slaves existing in those colonies. That includes those to the north. Now, in some of the colonies further north than Maryland, what we call the Mason-Dixon line, border between Maryland and Pennsylvania, in some of those there are very, very few slaves. And in all the northern colonies, slaves worked mostly as either domestic servants or like apprentices type to artisans or to merchants, as like clerks or personal servants in cities like Philadelphia or New York City. But in some colonies where there were white people of a religious background, like the Quakers or the Puritans in Massachusetts, who for their religious purposes couldn't exactly fully endorse like chattel slavery, you saw comparatively few. But in New York, there were more slaves in New York in the early 1700s than there were in Georgia. In fact, it gets to such a point in some of those northern colonies where they worry, oh shit, we've got too many slaves here. There could be an insurrection, an uprising. And ironically, that's among the things that leads those northern colonies eventually to outlaw slavery. But we're not there yet. And we've essentially run out of time. So, I don't want to start a new slide with only 2 minutes left. So what we'll do, I'll cut these last two slides off of this lecture and paste them to the front of our next lecture. And we'll work our way through the charter generations in America and the revolutionary generations in America, hopefully in one nice, short, efficient lecture. And we won't have to keep pushing content into a new lecture. But y'all know this is a new course for me, and so I'm never quite sure what we can fit into one lecture. So apologies for that. Are there any questions about what we did cover? Anything at all? Everything's clear. Okay.